Welcome back, everyone. I am Brian McCall, the editor-in-chief of Catholic Family News, and excited to bring you another special report interview. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Julia Meloni, who is we were just discussing, a graduate of Yale and Harvard. Very well-accomplished writer. You can see her pieces throughout a lot of different media, including Crisis Magazine, LifeSite News, I'm sure some others, but they're two I've seen. Welcome to the program today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
And our reason for today is you've been working on a book-length treatment of a topic we've mentioned on and off for years in the newspaper, the so-called St. Gallen Mafia, and this sort of group within the church. And as we record this today, we obviously are living through a lot of turmoil on the civil side, right? We have a lot of allegations of a coup underway that tampered with the election, and who a sort of concerted effort. Lots of big stories we've been covering there. But as Archbishop Vigano has mentioned several times in his communication, there's an interesting parallel between the church and the state, and he's referred to a deep church as well as a deep state. And the St. Gallen Mafia, as we'll see, is part of that even the Archbishop has referred to. So let's begin, if you don't mind, with just a little bit about your project. So maybe tell us how you became interested in researching this subject, and kind of where your work stands as of today.
Yeah, so I started wanting to really know the roots of this pontificate several years ago, when I realized that there was something wrong, pretty much when Amoris Laetitia came out. And as I started digging deeper, I realized that the roads were leading back to St. Gallen, and back to the St. Gallen Mafia. And there was one point about 3 years ago when I decided to actually pick up the book Night Conversations by Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini. He was the founder and leader of the St. Gallen Mafia. And one night I just stayed up reading this book, and there was something very eerie about it, because it was like the chronicle of a papacy foretold. It was basically, you had the sense that there was kind of this script in there for a future pope. And he, even in the beginning, he said, I am not an anti-pope, I'm an antipope, A-N-T-E.
Yes.
A precursor and preparer for the Holy Father. So as I started reading this work, I just felt like Martini was the hermeneutical key to the Francis pontificate. And I even started writing these articles where I would find Francis quoting things from Night Conversations without attribution. And it just really, and Austin Ivory, a papal biographer who is very fond of Francis, even says in his work on Francis that Francis really did like to quote Martini. So I started this, I just wrote, a series of different articles kind of focusing on this phenomenon. And I reached a certain point where I realized that this goes beyond a series of articles. It's time to write a book, because we need to know the deeper history of the mafia. We know from the biography of Cardinal Daniels, one of the members of the mafia, the famous biography. We know something about what they were doing. We know they were founded in the mid-1990s. We know that they favored Bergoglio in the 2005 conclave, but we weren't having enough of a conversation about, okay, what were they doing in the decades before the 1990s, and then what were they doing at the conclave, but also during the pontificate of Benedict. and then what kind of influence are they still having now. So this book, it starts, the first chapter starts with the 2005 conclave, right? In the middle of the action, and then kind of starts talking about the war against Benedict. And then it zooms out for a minute and it talks about how the war against Benedict, in many ways, the roots are laid many years before, around the time of the council and the post-council period. Then we go back into, the war on Benedict. And then finally, how do we transition into the current pontificate?
And yeah, really good point there, because I know maybe some people who are new to the Hiss are saying, "Oh, this just sounds like a conspiracy theory." Well, interestingly, conspiracy theories, in the sense that's used, are just people coming up with ideas without evidence, right? Something that's actually acknowledged historically isn't a conspiracy theory; it's a conspiracy fact, right? And as Father Wittigen in The Rhine Flows into the Tiber, as Dr. de Mattei in his book, The Second Vatican Council: An Untold Story, have said there was a conspiracy at the council, right there. It's, again, not a theory. Here are people that got together. Here's what they planned. Here's what they did. And again, that last point you said takes us back to that there seems to be a continuation of that after the council. That again is not a theory, is a fact, as you point to. People have made mention of it, but a fact that not a lot of people have gone into. So let's maybe start there. Here's a little map of Switzerland. So in case you're again, what is St. Gallen? What are we talking about? St. Gallen is a town in Switzerland, in the heart of Europe here. And actually, could you maybe point out on the map where it is in relation to some of the big cities here in Switzerland?
I'm not, I think it's kind of somewhere around here. Oh, there we go. There it is.
Yeah, there it is. There it is. Yes. So they're in the heart of this beautiful, idyllic country. And then I can also show you a picture from some travel literature, again, of what this town looks like. Looks like a little beautiful, ideal Swiss little town. So how does this name of this picturesque little town in Switzerland get associated with sort of church politics? So why is it referred to as St. Gallen? Maybe it's a little bit of history on that.
Yeah. The main thing I would say, just about the intersection of the city and church politics, is that in the post-council period, there was a group that was founded called the CCEE. I always get the exact words wrong, but the European Council of Cardinals, something to that effect.
Right.
And they wanted to kind of carry out the council, everything that had not been completed. And their seat became rooted in St. Gallen. And there's a certain bishop, Ivo Führer, who was seated there in St. Gallen, and he became the host with Martini of the St. Gallen group. But this group, the CCEE, they were talking about things on the agenda of this pontificate, like communion for the divorced and civilly remarried. I think they were talking about it in the 1970s, maybe even in the early 1970s. So there's definitely just we have different roots in that sense. And then the larger reason about why this specific city, I feel like for me, a lot of that is still kind of shrouded in mystery. I know other people have looked into this city and seen kind of rumblings of communism and communism training and other different things that they've discovered. So it's definitely a question worth pursuing further in the future.
So, as you've told us so far, a group of European cardinals, and again, if anyone's read a bit of history, like Father Wittigen's "The Rhine Flows into the Tiber," there was sort of a clique of European hierarchy, bishops and cardinals, who were very organized at the council. And so what you're now telling us is, after the council, a group of them continued because they, many of us look at the Second Vatican Council and say, wow, some things went too far. They sort of looked from the opposite way and said, there's unfinished business here. There are more things to be done. And so they start meeting in St. Gallen, hosted by the bishop you mentioned. So you mentioned a few names, Cardinal Daniels, who was very active in the council. You've mentioned the late Martini. So who are maybe some of the other figures who became involved in this group?
Yeah, the other key figures would be Walter Casper. We're familiar with Casper, of course, from the Casper proposal to open up communion to the divorced and civilly remarried. He was very active in the group. Also, Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor. He replaced another group, another member named Cardinal Basil Hume.
Yes.
And Basil Hume was the first president of the CCEE. So this group, really, I would say, if we want to look at the genesis of churchmen meeting in St. Gallen and being subversive, Basil Hume is a name that sticks out. And then he, in the early 1980s, that's when he first met Martini. And then Martini was really impressed by this speech that he gave at the synod on the 1980 synod on the family. And then he very soon after that he started engaging in the group. Hume placed a call to Daniels. Daniels started engaging in the group, and so you have this kind of core group in the CCEE around these three men. Now, Murphy O'Connor eventually, in around the late 1990s, early 2000s, takes over for the late Basil Hume. And Murphy O'Connor became great friends with Bergoglio. So Murphy O'Connor becomes this bridge between the mafia and Bergoglio. And one other name I have to throw out here. I know it's a lot of different people to juggle, but one other name is Cardinal Achille Silvestrini. And he was an Italian, and he was a diplomat, and he was older than a lot of the other members, older than someone like Murphy O'Connor. And Silvestrini, I mentioned before that Martini led the mafia, but at a certain point, Martini became too sick with Parkinson's to lead the group. And so Silvestrini took over. And Silvestrini is another link that we have with Bergoglio, because from all of my research, it's really Silvestrini who identified Bergoglio. I think there were multiple mafia members who were interested in him, but it's really Silvestrini who kind of led this push for Bergoglio, like in 2005 at the Conclave.
So looking at our map of Europe from the names, just to help the names you've thrown out. So we have, as we started with Martini, who was the bishop in Milan. So Milan's in northern Italy. Basil Hume, succeeded by Murphy O'Connor, was the Archbishop of London. London is the primal see now in England. And then we have Daniels in the sort of northern Europe. So you notice we have these cardinals coming together sort of from across Europe, from these sort of key places. And as you say, now they're identifying kind of candidates, or who can they have, as well as issues, right? Things that they want changed in the church. And you've identified one of those. So we have the idea of communion to the, sorry, I forget, Casper. Yes, obviously Casper from Germany. Communion to the divorced and remarried, something they're talking about, you tell us, in the 1970s. Then lo and behold, 50 years later, whereabouts, Casper comes up with his infamous proposal to do just that. Maybe what are some of the other issues that you've uncovered that they were identifying beyond this, communion to people living in mortal sin?
Yes. So luckily, Daniels's biography, which really is a form of the group coming out of the shadows, the deep church needing to confess and boast and kind of come out. luckily, Daniel's biography names a lot of these different issues that they were discussing. So we know from that biography that in 1999 at their meeting, so every a member would give a member or two would give like an annual presentation at their meeting, and their meeting was always in January at St. Gallen or near St. Gallen. And so in 1999, it was Martini's turn. And so he speaks about needing a new council. And he actually goes to the 1999 synod, and he gives this speech about this dream that he has. But the interesting thing is Daniel's biography says that Daniel's was sympathetic at that meeting to this idea, but he thought it wasn't really practical. He thought Martini was being too visionary. And so basically, Martini goes to this meeting and he kind of scales it down a little bit. Like he won't commit to the idea that it's a council. He's vague. Basically, a lot of the headlines say he called for a Vatican III, and then he says, "No, I didn't call for a Vatican III." He's being, just really evasive about it. And basically, a very important Vaticanist named Sandro Magister, looking back at that moment, says, basically Martini was giving us a blueprint for synodality, for different synods that would take on different issues. So that 1999 public speech that Martini gave is really like the clearest blueprint that we have about some of the different issues, but a lot of it is kind of in code. But when you read back through it, you can see things like priestly celibacy. You can, in code, you can see that it's the ordination of married men is there, the ordination of deaconesses, sexuality is there. Those are some of the main issues, again, the issues of the Francis pontificate. I would say one more thing, which is that the biography says that starting at the year 2000 or so, the Mafia became specifically very interested in the ethical and moral issues, and it specifically names the issues of communion for the divorced and civilly remarried, and the issue of homosexuality. So so again, we when we look for it, there are so many clues from the Mafia about just exactly what they want and what they're getting at.
Right, and again, those sources this is publicly available information. It's not speculation. The Daniel's biography, the 1999 speech, and then Martini himself, before he died, I think it was 2012 or thereabouts, he kind of publishes or gives a speech, which is sort of often referred to as his last will and testament, to the church, where he lays out exactly those same kinds of things on the eve of the next conclave that would give us Pope Francis. And exactly right, to recap those issues that were hit, they're going to sound familiar to you over the past 7 years. Communion to the divorced and civilly remarried, some form of acceptance of homosexuality and people living in those situations, a lessening or a complete elimination of celibacy in the priesthood, and opening up to ordination of women and focusing in on deaconesses, right? As again, if you've been listening or reading Catholic Family News for the past several years, you're going to know those are the exact things that either have occurred in this pontificate with, as you said, Amoris Laetitia, or the envelope was pushed on at the most recent Amazon Synod. So you told us this was their stated goals that they wanted to work towards to remake the church in their image. So now let's get to Bergoglio, because you say they identify, or at least some members identify him as kind of an interesting person to bring into their group. Why is it that they identify him? What about Bergoglio seems to be attracting their attention?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we have some clues about that from the work of Austin Ivory, who is, one of the most important biographers of Pope Francis. We've mentioned him just a few minutes ago, and he has in The Great Reformer, he talks about the issue of collegiality The issue that, you know, the bishops want a say in how the church is being run. We don't want it just to be Rome. And then he has this very interesting section where he talks about one of the issues, what that means in practice. Okay, and he mentions that there's this 2003 document that Ratzinger signed off on that was talking about how basically if you're a bishop, you need to be speaking out against attempts to redefine marriage. You need to be speaking out on these different cultural issues. You need to be vigorously opposing different subversive movements against these issues. And again, this is Ivory talking. Ivory says that in 2002, there was a civil unions law that passed in Buenos Aires, and Bergoglio didn't oppose it. And in fact, the way Ivory frames it, it sounds like Bergoglio didn't really have a problem with it, just based on his view that it wasn't really, allegedly it wasn't stepping on the toes of the institution of marriage. It was just a civil unions law. It was this kind of bifurcation between civil law and moral law. Now, this is a phrase, if we go back to the 1999 Dream speech that Martini gave us, what's the last issue that he names in his Dream speech? The relationship between civil law and moral law. And this is something that again comes up in the life of Daniels and the biography of Daniels, this chasm between the civil law and the moral law. So basically this idea that the civil law, what Benedict XVI would call the dictatorship of relativism, you know, should be allowed to operate, and we shouldn't really we should consider that as separate from our moral ideals. It's kind of the Francis phrase, you know, reality is more important than ideas, where there can be a chasm between this kind of Platonic idea, this ideal that we have, and then what really happens in practice. But anyway, so Ivory, in his biography, he raises this issue of Pope Francis being collegial. Bergoglio being collegial on this issue of homosexuality, civil unions, as early as 2002. And I find that really interesting because according to the biography of Daniels, they were talking about Bergoglio right around the time of 2002 at their meeting, because they were talking about the 2001 synod where Bergoglio was a synodal official. So I think he was rapporteur of the synod. So anyway, they sensed some kind of pastoral flexibility, I think, in Bergoglio very early on, whether it was that issue, the issue of course, there's reports that, I don't know when it started, but there's reliable reports that Bergoglio was allowing priests to give communion to the divorced and civilly remarried while he was in Buenos Aires as well. So I think that's the key issue that got him on their radar.
Right, and in that explanation, you point out, I think, an important characteristic that they saw in that Jorge Bergoglio, which is an element of modernism that we've talked about a lot of times in the paper and on these programs. So that modernism, again, what St. Pius X called the synthesis of all heresies, one of its attributes is exactly what you and even Pope Benedict identified, this disconnect in spheres. So civil law versus morality. And so the modernists can say in this era, well, as a Catholic, I obviously support marriage as the lifelong relationship between a man and a woman. But in the civil sphere, I can support the opposite of that you can have these areas where there's sort of two truths, to bring up a medieval heresy that many times I've talked about, I think, is modernism is just revised, that you can have two truths. So in one area of life, you can believe X, But then when you switch to theology, you can believe the opposite of X because you're in a different sphere. And it seemed, as you point out, that Bergoglio, as the Bishop of Buenos Aires, was very open to this idea. And if our viewers are wondering, wow, this sounds familiar, he supported civil unions, that's because, as many of you know, we reported in the film Francisco, there's some quotations from him where he says exactly the same thing now as Pope, that he thinks civil union should be granted to them, which accords with what we're told he did support in Buenos Aires. So don't call them marriages, that's okay, but if they're essentially marriage under a different name in a different sphere, then that's fine as well. So this openness, as you say, and this openness to synodality, I think that's another important point. The traditional ecclesiology of the church, right, is you have the Pope as the monarch of the church, and then each individual bishop as sort of the monarch of their diocese with personal direct responsibility up to the Pope and down to their flock. And this is really the model of church governance, where what happens with collegiality is this movement away from that, where bishops are this sort of not individually responsible both down and up, but as a group, almost like a parliament, right? And a parliament that can vote and decide, and the Pope has to sort of negotiate with, the way, again, medieval monarchs had to negotiate with their parliaments to get taxes. That's, again, I think the second point you point out that they see in Bergoglio, his openness to this new model of church government, where the Pope sort of presides as the president of the assembly over this parliament that's going to take votes, as opposed to having this direct relationship with bishops and then directly to their people. So you point out that they identify Bergoglio. So was he brought into this group? Did he become a member of it, or was he just sort of I guess, let's see, in the spy literature, an asset that they looked at having?
Yeah, there's no evidence I've seen that he was a member of the group. Again, Sandro Magister, the eminent Vaticanist, says, Bergoglio never set foot in St. Gallen, but he knew how to adapt himself to their wants and desires for a pope. One of the interesting stories that I tell, again, in that first chapter in my book on the St. Gallen Mafia, that's talking about the conclave, is kind of there appears to have been division in the group about Bergoglio, and I don't think that story has fully been reckoned with at this point, and it might help explain some of the strange mysteries of the conclave about why the progressives seemed so scattered. But the story basically is that Silvestrini, again, was the one who really identified Bergoglio and was pushing for Bergoglio as Pope in 2005. But according to an anonymous cardinal who's quoted by Nicholas Diat, a very, very important writer, according to him, Martini didn't want Bergoglio at that time, which is very interesting because Martini, I always had this view that they were always in sync completely. But this intelligence says that no, at that time, Martini was very opposed to Bergoglio.
And so, at that time, you mean the 2005 conclave? Is that
yes?
Yes. Okay.
Yes, exactly, because they were both Jesuits.
Yes.
And Bergoglio was a very divisive figure. And Bergoglio, I think Martini didn't think that he was progressive enough. So even though I've spoken about some traits that they admired about Bergoglio, we have to remember Martini was a real radical. Like he was saying things that now Pope Francis, might be advocating, but Martini was saying these things decades before. So Martini was very radical for his time, and there was some kind of chasm there, especially going back to their history in the Jesuits. And I try to talk a little bit in the book about this mystery, But at some point, I think Martini, we have some evidence from things that Eugenio Scalfari and others have said,
Mm.
basically saying that, the late Martini admired Bergoglio. He would talk about the positions that they fully shared. So I think that probably something happened with Martini where he came around to understanding that the mafia, they one of the great realizations of the book that I had was that the mafia, it's not just as if Bergoglio needed the mafia to help launch his career, so to speak. The mafia needed Bergoglio. They needed his style. They needed his strengths as a revolutionary to help their revolution take off, because these were men who were dreamers. They were talking about different things, and yet in a lot of ways they couldn't quite get their revolution off the ground. And of course we can just see with this pontificate what Pope Francis has been able to accomplish in terms of their agenda.
So they had all these big ideas. They needed a foot soldier, somebody who can actually, interesting what you say about reality, and somebody in reality that can actually do
Yes.
some things. Interesting. And one other thought when you were describing their relationship with him that's interesting. Again, we've talked a lot about the permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita, the
Mm-hmm.
text that came to light in the 19th century about the Freemasons' plans to get involved in the church. And one of the interesting things about that document that the popes discovered is the Freemasons don't say we're going to get a Freemason elected pope. We're going to like
Mm-hmm.
infiltrate in that sense, but they say what we want is not a pope who is a Freemason, but a pope who will be disposed to everything we want to do to bring about our revolution in their phrase tiara and cope. And very much that reminded me when we were talking about what they identify in Bergoglio. So he's not someone that's part of their inner circle, but someone who they it maps on to their ideas, who will get them done, but who is in that little bit of distance, or he's not part of their
Mm-hmm.
circle, but is sort of useful. It's very similar technique. Very,
Mm-hmm.
very interesting. And now that's interesting what you point out, because it's always been a mystery to some people. So how did the College of Cardinals produce Ratzinger in 2005, and 8 years later, you know, what almost seems to be an anti-Ratzinger in many
Yes.
ways? But what you identify is, well, it could have been that the progressive vote was a little disunified in
Mm-hmm.
2005, and they were split. Whereas, and maybe it was the pontificate of Pope Benedict that galvanized them. They were more
Mm-hmm.
organized. So maybe do you spend some time looking into what you can find out about the 2013 conclave? Do you bring it up to that point to examine what happened there?
Yes, great question.
Yeah.
I do talk about the 2013 conclave. I talk about, so just kind of, first of all, gathering what we do have,
Yes.
so many great resources from so many different sides of the conversation. And definitely, I try to focus on specific little details that I think
Mm.
are just kind of that complexify some of the narratives surrounding the conclave. So
Mm.
I do have some certain details there that I find curious, that I haven't really seen other people
Mm.
identify and speak about, that I'll definitely be kind of alluding to there as well. Yes.
Interesting. Yes. Because again, the church's understanding of conclaves is supposed to be, an openness to the inspiration of the Holy Ghost. The participants are not supposed to politic, right? There isn't supposed to be, in the church's view, this sort of like we see in the United States presidential election, right? Months of politicking and campaigning. But interestingly, and maybe you'll provide some more detail, there clearly seemed to be evidence of that going on, not just around the conclave, but for years, perhaps years in advance. So
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
the mind of the church.
Yeah, if I could
Yes.
just jump in here for a
Yes.
moment. When you spoke about the maybe the pontificate of Benedict
Yes.
galvanized them. I do think that, so the first part of my book is called War,
Mm.
and it's about the war against Benedict, starting with the conclave, going, all the way through his time as Pope. And I definitely do believe that they wanted a second chance, and they wanted to fix the mistakes of the past, and they wanted to war against Benedict's agenda. So definitely, I tried to identify some of the main
Mm.
aspects of this war against Benedict, and I feel like it's on one plane, it's this war against Benedict's agenda. Benedict, of course, he gave us Summorum Pontificum. He, gave us the texts that reaffirmed that there's no communion for the divorced and civilly remarried. He gave us many treasures of
Mm-hmm.
tradition, and of course, they were warring to undermine that. And at the same time, on this other plane, I feel like they had this constant sense that Bergoglio, there was still time for Bergoglio. Like, maybe
Mm.
they're running out of time, but there's still some time. There's some specific objects I'll be talking about in the book that I believe there's a certain mysterious text that I believe is identified with Cardinal Silvestrini, that kind of speaks kind of eerily about Bergoglio, about kind of
Yes.
like Bergoglio. We need to remember how he performed at the conclave, in case there's still, and just in case, there's still time for another conclave soon, or
Mm.
something to that effect. That So when we get to the 2013 conclave, so one detail I will throw out there is that if you look at some of the old footage of CNN doing coverage of the 2013 conclave, you have Chris Cuomo did a lot of that coverage, and he he said that he said on air one day, "I was told to keep an eye on Bergoglio." And that was very interesting to me.
Yes.
And I looked at some of his tweets, and he actually, a couple of years after the fact, when Bergoglio, had already been elected as Pope Francis, Cuomo was kind of reminiscing about some of this stuff, and saying, and giving further details about how he was told by retired cardinals to keep an eye on Bergoglio. And so these are the kinds of little details I'm talking about. There's other little details that I haven't really seen other people get into, that they just kind of, they make you wonder about what was going on.
Well, we've seen obviously in this country the role the media has played in being allies of the
Mm-hmm.
forces of socialism here. So again, I've not heard about that Chris Cuomo before, but I guess it doesn't surprise me to hear there would be kind of an interesting information back channel between
Mm-hmm.
some participants and someone like CNN's Chris Cuomo. Interesting. Wow. Well, this has just been fascinating discussing, and again, it's important because although the church is, as we always say here, is a divine institution, the gates of hell will not prevail. It also is a human element that lives through time, and for whatever reason, God's providence chose us to live in this particular time. So he wants us to be aware of what our time is and what's going on in the church, because he's using that human element of the church ultimately for his own purposes. But he doesn't want us to just sort of bury our heads and hide our heads and say, well, church is divine. We don't need to worry about it, right? We're here at a moment in history that he chose for us. It's funny. You may appreciate this. I have a good priest who I was talking to once, and I said, I just, it's so hard to live in this time. Why couldn't I have been born back in the age of faith when everybody was Christian and it'd be so easy to be Catholic back then? And he said, God put us in the time that we were most likely to save our souls. And he said, we're here for a reason. He said, you know, we're here to bring whatever qualities we need to bring. He said, maybe in medieval times, given our personality and who we are, the things that we're good at would have led us to become a heretic, and we would, we would have become so rebellious or something. So he said, you have to always think of it that way, and that's important. So we obviously don't want to study these things to become discouraged or to lose hope, but to be in touch with reality, what's really going on, and to be aware of it, so that we can do what our Lord wants us to do, to judge things by their fruits, to judge them, what's going on appropriately. And to do that, we have to know the story, what's going on. So I want to thank you for all of this work you've done in researching and pulling it all together. So our readers know, I think you're finishing up, as you told me, writing the book or putting finishing touches on it. Hopefully, do you have any predictions when we might be able to see this in print, so we can all start delving into the details?
Unfortunately, I don't know the exact timeline, but definitely, I know my Twitter page will definitely have further details right as soon as they become available. It's Julia Meloni 1. So yeah, I really definitely appreciate any and all interest in all of that.
Great. So please, yes, follow Julia Meloni 1 on Twitter. And we at Catholic Family News will keep an eye on it, and certainly publicize, let people know when the book is here, because it sounds like this is going to become a classic, like the great books I've referred to on sort of the history of the conciliar and post-conciliar era that have sustained us to know what's going on. So really looking forward to it. And thank you for taking time out of your writing and your work to share a little glimpse into the facts that you've uncovered in your work. And we wish you success in bringing the book to publication.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for listening into this podcast or watching it. If you've enjoyed our free content here, please, all we ask in return is you share it with everyone that you know. Again, with all that's going on in the world now, there's a real openness to people to see what may have been going on, what assumptions that I've made about history and the way things have happened I need to question. So, share this with maybe everyone in your contact list. It may spark some new interest in the topic. So please share the content, follow us on your social media platform, on our YouTube channel. And then again, if you enjoy the free content, please consider subscribing to our monthly newspaper. You can subscribe for as little as $32 a month for an e-edition electronic version of the paper every month. So please take a look at that. Thank you, and I'll look forward to seeing you on our next weekly news roundup, when I'll be joined by Managing Editor Matt Gaspars. Thank you, and God bless you.